Dámy a pánové, srdeční hosté, já vás velmi vítám v sále Nejvyššího purkrabství na Pražském Hradě u další z přednášek našeho cyklu Věda na Hradě, kterou organizuje Správa Pražského hradu společně s Ústavem organické chemie a biochemie Akademie věd a také s Karlovou univerzitou. A já mám tu milou povinnost vlastně dnes zde přivítat vzácného hosta až z New Yorku, Doktorku Burton, která sedí tamhle. A předtím bych ráda pozvala na pódium Zuzanu Válkovou, novinářku, která bude tak laskavá a našeho dnešního hosta představí. Děkuji vám.
So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm absolutely thrilled that I'm able to introduce tonight's guest, Dr. Isabella Burton, who's made the trip from New York, if I'm not mistaken. She was supposed to come from Italy, weren't you? Yeah, lovely. Lovely to have you here. And Dr. Burton holds a doctorate from theology from Trinity College in Oxford. She's also a culture critic, and besides all of that, she's a brilliant writer. She's a novelist. She also writes non-fiction, and that's how I encountered her writing last year. Because last year it was when she published her book, which is called Self-Made, which I believe is at the core of tonight's lecture. Yes, thank you, Tara, she's nodding. And Self-Made is a brilliant book, which the New York Times, let me get this right, please, called A Breezy History of Self-Branding. If you wonder what that is, let me summarize it very, very simply and briefly. Well, Tara Isabella Burton analyzed the strategies that we as people choose to stand out from the crowd. She starts roughly in the Renaissance, and she chooses several historical personalities to showcase how people in their era decided to become unique and capitalize on it. Am I summarizing it roughly? Roughly, is it okay? Thank you very much. And I thought that her exploration was particularly fascinating at an era where we are all mostly used to the term personal brand. We know what that is good for. And at the same time, we live at an age where most of us tend to think from time to time that we are unique. The invention of self-invention is a fascinating phenomenon, and I believe that this is the right point where we should be asking the question what it means to be authentic again. Are we unique? Are we normal? Are we authentic? How do I tell what's what? So this is me, Tara. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
How's my volume? We can all hear me? Yes. Fantastic. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. Susanna, thank you to the whole team at Prague Castle. It's been an absolute delight to be here. This is one of the coolest place I've ever given a lecture, so I'm delighted. So I'd like to start this conversation by inviting you to consider one particular advertising campaign from January 2020 for the high-end boutique fitness chain, very popular in the United States, called Equinox. Now, produced by a marketing studio called Droga 5, the campaign, entitled Make Yourself a Gift to the World, featured a series of images devoted to the ideal gym goer as a kind of mythological demigod of self-care. One of the posters, for example, features a powerful woman who is easily lifting up two men, kind of like the biblical Samson. Another features a shirtless man lying on a funeral pyre attended by frenetic worshippers. The purpose of this campaign, according to the marketing firm, was to depict, and I quote, divine characters as God-like gifts to the world in moments and situations that reflect their self-worship as serving a larger purpose to humanity. Asking the question, and this is also a quote, does that not make self-obsession the most selfless act of all? Or, as one Equinox chief marketer told a journalist, we're targeting individuals dedicated to becoming the very best they can be because, quote, when you become the best version of yourself, you radiate outward and contribute more to the world around you. Now, Equinox is not exactly representative of the average American life. Gyms, it's a gym whose prices start at $250 a month plus initiation fees. Its advertising campaigns are often very intentionally transgressive or controversial. Famously, one year they refused to have new members in January because they said anyone who says it's a New Year's resolution to get in shape is not serious enough for them. They only wanted serious gym goers. So they're very good at personal branding or corporate branding to create a certain image of themselves. All that being said, however, I think this set of advertisements can tell us something really important about contemporary life in the United States and increasingly in the sort of internet-saturated West more broadly. This idea that you not only can, but should make yourself into a kind of God, make yourself into a divine figure by channeling your energy, by hard work, by curating your persona and your personality and your body and your bank account and turning everything about you into raw material for the product that you are trying to sell to the world. This idea has, to use a contemporary term, gone viral. It's become part of almost every aspect, and speaking, this book is largely about, but not exclusively about the United States, about contemporary life. Anyone with a smartphone, that's 90% of Americans, I'm not sure precisely global numbers, but anyone with a smartphone is basically expected to constantly present themselves personally and professionally. In the United States, most new couples meet on dating sites, so you have to have your dating profile if you want to meet somebody. If you're like about 60% of Americans, participating in the gig economy in some way, whether it's a side hustle on a website like TaskRabbit or Uber Eats. You create these different, often profiles to advertise yourself. If you, like me, are in the arts or journalism, you need to use Twitter/X or Instagram or any of these platforms to sell yourself. So there's a lot of different approaches we can take to this problem of personal branding, of self-invention. I could talk to you about Kim Kardashian. I could talk to you about Donald Trump. But I'm a trained theologian. My background is in theology. And so today I'm going to talk to you not about God exactly, but about the way in which ideas about the self and the self's freedom go hand in hand historically with shared cultural ideas about who or what, if anything, is divine out there. Are we created by a higher power for a particular purpose, as for much of Western history was the default shared view, at least publicly and civilly and socially, if not in sort of everyone's private beliefs? Or are we our own gods? Are we the ones in charge of deciding what is meaning, what is truth? And in Self-Made, I argue that there is this huge cultural shift that takes place from about the Renaissance well into the present day, in which the idea that we have not only the potential, but the obligation to create ourselves goes hand in hand with the decline of organized institutional religion and new visions of authority. So where are we right now? We are in perhaps the most extreme version of self-creation that has ever existed. As of 2021, and this number I'm sure has only gone up, influencing had become almost a $14 billion industry. 75% of American brands now budget separately for influencer marketing. Influencer is actually one of the top career goals for Generation Z. I recently did a version of this at a college class, and I just asked the students, I said, how many of you would post sponsored content for money? Everyone's hand actually went up. I think 1 or 2 people said no. Just out of curiosity, show of hands, how many of you would post sponsored content for money if given the opportunity? All right, it took a second. I'm glad some of you admitted it. All right, that's about 30%, let's say, give or take. But if I want to leave, sort of invite you to think about this problem or this question in a new way, it's this. Where do we get the quote-unquote authority what is about who we want to be, and how does who we want to be shape our sense of who we really are? It's an age-old human question. What makes us us? Is it the stuff we're born with? Is it our social class, our race, our sex, our nationality, our family? Or is it what we choose? Are we defined by what we want? And if I have a thesis in Self-Made, it's that the pendulum has shifted very dramatically over the past few hundred years, and particularly in the past few decades since the dawn of the internet. That if there is anything close to a civil religion, let's just say in the United States or the sort of internet-saturated contemporary West more broadly, it is that the closest thing there is to a divine force, a sacred force, a magical force, it is the shape of our desires, that we truly, really, authentically are whoever we want to be, and that reality is what you make it. These might seem like a kind of abstract, esoteric phenomena, but if you spend any time on wellness Instagram or looking at, if you're involved in something called, I don't know if it's as big here as it is in the United States, manifesting. It's big on TikTok, and about 50% of Americans say they believe in it. The idea that if you focus hard on what you want, whether it's landing a particular partner or getting rich or changing your health, you will get in touch with the energy of the universe, and it will happen for you. Again, 50% of Americans, according to the latest study, believe that this works. About 20% say they've tried it. The study doesn't say whether it worked or not. So my research in Self-Made is a genealogy of this idea. How did we get from medieval Christendom, so to speak, to a world where 50% of Americans believe in manifesting? And there's basically 4 steps in this process, and I will, without hopefully going too over time, give you an indication of what they are. So the first step in this process, which we can sort of loosely associate with the Renaissance, is the idea that the self-maker is a kind of special divine being, a demigod, someone who perhaps by being chosen by God or chosen by nature or by having some mysterious special quality, sets himself, and historically when we talk about self-makers, about men, at least until, let's say, the late 19th and early 20th centuries, that the self-maker, it kind of appropriates the divine right of being able to determine his own destiny because he's special and distinct. But this is something that only he has, and not everybody has. This is not a democratic vision. I'll expand on that in a second. The second point that I want to make, this is a transition that happens a little later in the European Enlightenment, is what I call in my book the disenchantment of custom. The idea that custom, what we do, social rules, what we wear, rules about food, clothing, sexuality, are not God-given or part of natural law or handed down by some kind of true order. They're arbitrary, they're made up. And so, a lot of these Enlightenment thinkers argue, they're subject to change. The third stage in this process, which happens largely in the 19th century, is what I call the re-enchantment of desire. That having kind of struck down the notion that the social order has any theological weight, it's not God-given, it's not sacred, it's holy, people, and this happens differently in Europe and in America in these 2 different ways, start to reimagine human desire, the human will, our hunger for money or power or sex as a kind of quasi-magical force. And as we'll see, some of the language that gets used around it, especially in the United States, is very, very spiritual or even magical in nature. And finally, the final transition we have in the 20th and then the 21st century is basically the creation of celebrity culture in the wake of the development of cinema, of the old Hollywood studio system in particular, kind of fuses some of the tensions that we will see throughout this lecture between, is this a power that is innate and only for the special? Is it a power that anyone can have? Is it a power that you fake? Is it a power that is true? All of these questions get resolved in the cultural figure of the Hollywood star. So you don't have to remember all that because I'm going to go over it again more slowly and in more detail. So let's start with this first idea, the idea that the self-maker, the person who creates himself, is a kind of demigod. We find this idea start to really come to the forefront of cultural conversations in the European Renaissance, particularly, though not exclusively, the Italian Renaissance, which makes sense. It is a time of then unprecedented social mobility. Technological developments, economic developments, from the invention of the printing press to the development of urban centers like Florence and Nuremberg, mean that for the first time there's a kind of transition between, there's the opportunity for social mobility for certain kinds of people who have certain sets of skills. Humanists like Poggio Bracciolini, engineers like Leonardo da Vinci, and artists like Giotto or Albrecht Dürer, who we'll talk about in a second, who are able to kind of attain not aristocratic status, but a kind of para-aristocratic status. They're able to socialize in these worlds, not because of where or how they are born, but because of their own personal qualities. And this becomes striking and interesting and even controversial enough to be the subject of a lot of contemporary debate. How do we understand these people who don't quite fit in? Are they breaking rules? Are they special because they've earned it? Are they special for some other reason? And often the language that gets used around them in contemporary Renaissance dialogues is, interestingly, the demigod, as if they are the bastard children of God and a mortal woman. Often, actually, the imagery used is very similar to classical imagery of demigods like Hercules or Aeneas, these kind of fusion of divine and human. And often the implicit language of being a bastard, an illegitimate child, is used. Not only were some of these figures, including Da Vinci, literally illegitimate, but this language was used to kind of say, okay, his earthly father was a peasant, or was just an apothecary, wasn't significant, but his real father is God. He's really, in some kind of deep way, chosen as a true noble. And we can see a little bit of this idea of the genius, the self-maker as demigod, in what is often considered the first selfie. Albrecht Dürer's 1500 self-portrait. Now, until this time, self-portraits were pretty rare. If an artist dared to paint himself, it would often be there's a religious scene and he's in the background somewhere, Jesus is being born or crucified or something, and then you look in the back and there's a bunch of people watching and one of them looks a little bit like the artist. Dürer changes all that. And through the course of his career, he repeatedly makes himself the subject of his own portraits. He's not just putting himself in something else, although he does indeed do that, in one of the Adoration of the Magi he paints. But in this particular painting, painted in 1500, he paints himself basically as Jesus. He is dressed in ermine, associated with royalty, which he was not. He was a goldsmith's son. His hair is, fun fact, his hair is brown, which at the time they were quote unquote eyewitness accounts of Jesus, many forgeries. There was a very big sense that Jesus' hair was brown. We know that from other paintings, Dürer was blonde. So he changes his hair color to make himself look more like Jesus. You might see that the way that he's touching his fur is a little reminiscent of the kind of traditional hand gestures that Jesus would make in traditional iconography. He's also looking straight at the viewer. So what does this tell us about Dürer's sense of himself as an artist? To me, this indicates not just that Dürer says, well, I'm important, I am worthy of respect, I'm worthy of being seen, but he's hinting, I am worthy of being worshipped. That being a creator of art, being a genius, having this God-given innate power, makes me not like other men, not like other people. It makes me divine. And this is a theme that comes up again and again in his own art, in his self-promotion, in some of his letters. He's not the most modest man, Dürer. But at the same time that all of this is happening, these ideas of some people are just special, they're God-given, they're what I call in my book God's bastards, this raises another question, a question that the history of self-creation never quite resolved. And for those of you, I don't know if this is too culturally specific or American, there's a commercial for a makeup brand called Maybelline. And the tagline is, maybe she's born with it, maybe it's Maybelline. And this kind of same tension happens with self-making. Are you born with it? Are you born with the specialness? Or is it something that you work for? Or, option 3, is it something you can fake? Or fake it till you make it, as they say. Because I like to say that every time in history you find a theory of a special, magical, God-given ability to raise yourself among other people and determine your own destiny, you find a series of self-help books that tell you how to get it and fake it. And in this case, I refer you to Baldassare Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier, which it's a discussion at an Italian court among various courtiers. It's done in the form of a dialogue over what the ideal courtier would be like. And this idea comes up in the course of this conversation in this book, written in 1528, so around the same time as Dürer, give or take, is this idea of this wonderful, really untranslatable Italian word called sprezzatura. It sort of means lightness or nonchalance, but like no English translation quite gets at what it means. Maybe you just have to be Italian. I'm only half Italian, so I can only get it a little. But the idea behind it is that geniuses can do everything effortlessly. They're so chosen by God that they can just pick up a paintbrush and create something without even being taught. A lot of actually contemporary stories about Giotto, about Da Vinci, are told, a recurrent theme is like, they're 5 years old and they pick up a brush and they immediately do something so good that their elders, throw out their own paintbrushes out the window and cry and say, I'll never paint again because I'm not as good as this 5-year-old. It didn't happen, of course, but this is a common narrative that you find told about these artists. But if you can't be one of those geniuses, Castiglione suggests, the next best thing is you pretend to be one. You make it look effortless. If you're able to present yourself as nonchalant, as light, as being able to just be so cool that you don't even have to try, no one will really know that you're faking it. And so this tension already in the Renaissance comes up. This idea that there's something divine about the self-maker, that there's a tension between whether it's earned or innate, and that maybe, just maybe, faking it or wanting it badly enough that you present yourself artificially, as long as it doesn't look too artificial, might be a way that if you're not one of these special people, you can still sneak into being considered one of the special people. So this brings us to, how am I doing for time? Good, not too, I'm going quickly, we're fine. Part 2, the disenchantment of custom. So already we have some of this tension about the divinity and the specialness of the genius. But it's still within very much a Christian religious context. Now, of course, there's other religious and spiritual factors at play here. There's the rise of interest in the Renaissance of Greek and Roman thought, as well as Neoplatonism. But by and large, we can say this is still kind of a Christian worldview, that God, and sometimes writers will refer to nature or fortune, but it's still God picks some people and doesn't pick others. Around the Enlightenment, a period of massive resistance to and questioning of the power of the church, particularly the Catholic Church, although religion more generally, there comes this bigger question, this question of why do we do the things we do, from the social order to sexual mores to clothing. And there arises this increasing sense on the part of many Enlightenment philosophers that just because we do things the way we've always done things doesn't mean they're sacred, doesn't mean they're special. And this is a huge contrast to what has gone before. When we think of medieval and even early modern senses of political theology, what it kind of comes across is this idea, we find this in Thomas Aquinas, for example, the medieval philosopher saint, of natural law, that God has created birds and trees and flowers and fields, and God has also created kings and princes and priests and popes and peasants, that everything has its place. Our social order, like the natural order, is something that is predetermined and has a meaning that we do not decide, but God decides. But around the sort of the 18th century in particular, throughout the Enlightenment, not only does this idea start to change, custom becomes kind of a dirty word, an insult. The idea of doing something because it's custom means that you're a stupid sheep. For example, the French philosopher Montaigne refers to custom as a violent and treacherous schoolmistress. She, by little and little, slyly and unperceived, slips in the foot of her authority, but having by this gentle and humble beginning, with the benefit of time, fixed and established it, she then unmasks a furious and tyrannic countenance, against which we have no more the courage or the power so much as to lift up our eyes. We see her at every turn, forcing and violating the rules of nature. So even this contrast between custom and nature, which becomes such a huge part of Enlightenment thought, is a huge break with what come before. A few hundred years earlier, if you ask someone what's the difference between custom and nature, they'd say, what are you talking about? That's the same thing. What natural law is part of a grand total whole. Instead, this new idea comes that actually custom is something that it's not just not nature, it's opposed to nature, it's the enemy of nature. The nature is something that is true, that is inward, that is individual. It's something that we apprehend by looking inside ourselves and not at other people, not at what a king tells us or the Pope tells us. And around this time, you find a whole genre of literature designed to kind of hammer this point home, that human freedom exists only when we realize that the things that we've always done, including our social roles, are completely arbitrary, especially when it comes to sex. There's a subgenre that's just about sexual freedom. Actually, there's quite a lot of anti-clerical pornography on the subject that I will not get into here, but I'm sure you could Google them if you wanted. But from Diderot, Montesquieu, Voltaire, pretty much any Enlightenment philosopher you can name has written an essay playing with this idea that nothing is fixed. Everything is up for grabs. Everything is open to interpretation based on human individual reason. That authority, social custom, the rules of the many, these are things that get in the way of who we truly are. They are opposed to use a later word, authenticity. So make of that you will. That's part 2. Part 3, then we sort of see two diverging visions in the story of self-making that start really in the late 18th, but mostly the 19th century. In my book, I call these the aristocratic model and the democratic model. You can call these also the European model and the American model. These are very localized. But we see two ways that human desire becomes re-enchanted, becomes suffused with the same kind of language of magic, of holiness, of sacredness, of spirituality that a few hundred years before we had seen in language around natural law and the social order. So I'll start with the European model. I also call this in my book the dandiest model. We see these, and I do want to say here, the two figures that I use in talking about self-creation in my book seem very opposed to one another at first glance. There's the dandy, the individual who creates life as art and lives his life as a work of art. And there's the entrepreneur, and if you're familiar with ideas of the American dream and the Great Gatsby, the hard scrabble person who comes from nothing and makes a bunch of money and becomes self-made in an economic sense. And you might think, what do these two figures have to do with each other? They're nothing alike. One of them sort of swans around all day sitting in cafes, and one of them's at the office getting grubby. But I argue that in the 19th century, both of these figures come out of the same philosophical soil. The idea that the self has the power and increasingly the moral obligation to create themselves, be it economically or aesthetically. So I will say, in the European dandiest model, the spiritualized language is not as present as we shall see the American model, but it's still there. Barbie d'Orfeli in his history of dandyism, refers to dandies as miniature gods. There's a wonderful sort of occultist dandy called Sarah-Joséphine Péladan that wrote a series of basically occult texts about how to turn one's self-presentation into a form of literal magic. He wrote a book called How to Become a Mage for Men. He wrote a female equivalent called How to Become a Fairy. That one was less good. It mostly involved being sexy for men. And a third essay called Kaloprosopia, Beautiful Personality, the art of the beautiful personality. And in each of these cases, the idea that the self could change reality by focusing not just his desires, but his sense of self, that they could be so powerful, so magnetic, that they would actually change the world around them, was an integral part of the idea that self-making wasn't just aesthetic, it also had a kind of quasi-religious component. But at the same time, there was perhaps a little bit of what you might call implicit nihilism in this. The idea, well, there's nothing transcendently real out there. There's no God. There's no person in charge of the universe saying, you were born to be this like this, and you were born to be like that, and civilization should work like this. Reality is up to us because there's nothing else. And the most perhaps famous and representative version of this way of thinking is the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, someone who was very influenced by and inspired by sort of the 19th century cult of dandyism. He still, in many of his writings, including The Gay Science, talks about creating oneself as a work of art, philosophically echoing language that had been used in more narrow aesthetic circumstances a couple of generations earlier. But for Nietzsche, God was dead. Civilization no longer needed God or the idea, what he thought of as the fiction of God, to run. What civilization needed then was an acceptance of that fact, and an acceptance, too, of the idea that in the absence of God, there would be a vacuum. And the people to fill that vacuum were what he called the Übermensch, the Uberman, the individual with the clear-sighted courage, not just to accept the fact that there was no God, but to impose his own reality, his own kind of shaping of the world onto reality, that will became not quite magical, but the closest thing to divinity that there was in the world. Meanwhile, in the United States, the story looked a little bit different, but no less, in fact, far more sacralized. So I think many of you are probably already familiar with this sort of deeply capitalist American notion of, you find it in everyone from Benjamin Franklin to Frederick Douglass, of work hard and do your best and sweat and get the elbow grease in there, and you will have money, you will have power, you will have success. The American dreams means that nobody who tries hard will ever be left behind. Nothing bad ever happens to good people. Perhaps I'm overstating the case, but this is indeed the subtext of a lot of these narratives. And early on, I would say, to be quite generous, in the 18th century, the American vision of self-making was not exclusively capitalistic. There was a real sort of democratic political dimension, the idea that we can govern ourselves politically for the first time. But in order to govern ourselves politically, to earn that morally, we have to govern ourselves personally. So, the Benjamin Franklin, early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. These kind of idea that if we can control ourselves and be sober and work hard, we are earning the right to take part in this new political experiment. Almost immediately, a couple generations later, that all changes. By what's called the Gilded Age, the late 19th century, a time of massive wealth inequality, where new technologies, new industries were making millionaires and billionaires out of figures like Andrew Carnegie and J.D. Rockefeller, there becomes a fascination with this idea that the universe wants people not just to be a gentleman, sober-minded, industrious, work hard, live a good, solid middle-class lifestyle. The universe wants you to be as rich as possible. And the richer you are, the more the universe loves you. This idea that wealth, that success, that economic power are signs of a kind of spiritual favor really come to the forefront in the late 19th century when they're twinned with a pseudo-scientific, pseudo-spiritual movement that far too few people have heard of called New Thought. I like to say New Thought is the most influential religious movement that no one's ever heard of. But it basically starts in the 1860s. There's a clockmaker named Phineas Parker Quimby. And he's also a faith healer. He likes to put his hand on people and cure them of their diseases. There's only one problem. It doesn't always work. And he's trying to figure out why doesn't it always work? I put my hand on them, I say the words, they don't get better. And he thinks, could it be me? Am I doing something wrong? No, he thinks it can't be it. Instead, he decides the problem is the patient. Some people just don't want to get better. And he develops this whole theory of New Thought, also known as the mind cure, around the idea that if you focus hard enough, if you want it badly enough, if you visualize it by closing your eyes and focusing your mind, you can get in touch with the spiritual energy, the vibes out there in the universe, and you can make them do your will. He doesn't write books himself, but he gets a lot of followers who get really into this idea of New Thought. Among them is Mary Baker Eddy, who founded the the Christian Science church tradition as a kind of fusion of New Thought and Christianity. But then by the Gilded Age, it's what starts out as just a kind of medical thing turns into something bigger. As writers of self-help books, once again, this idea of the self-help tradition as a parallel idea to the special person. These self-help books all say the same thing. You can use this strategy to make money. If you close your eyes, if you will yourself badly enough, you too can become a millionaire. And if you don't, it means you just didn't try hard enough. You didn't want it badly enough. And this idea gets hugely, hugely popular in the late 19th century. Dozens, if not hundreds, of self-help books become bestsellers, all making the same claim. This becomes, at the time, then taken up with other scientific developments of the time, including the then novel idea of electricity, as well as the then recent ideas about evolution. And as today, when you get sort of new scientific discoveries, you also get a lot of pop science and pseudoscience and people who don't really understand what the science says but want to use it to prove a point. All of these scientific movements together create this kind of cultural soup where people think the universe is just this vast sense of energy. It's kind of like electricity. There's a current pulsing through all of us. And if we just focus hard enough, if we just want it badly enough, we can have it. We can have whatever we want as long as we want it badly enough. And this idea, which has actually really continued into the present day, if any of you have heard of a self-help book from 2005 called The Secret, The Law of Attraction, made popular by Oprah, that is classic New Thought, like barely even updated, nothing has changed. If you read something from 1890s, you read The Secret, it's the exact same language. Similarly, this idea of manifesting, so big on TikTok, is basically, once again, warmed over New Thought. But central to this idea of New Thought is the idea, a kind of mirror image of the Nietzschean version of the Übermensch, that desire makes reality real. What we want is the truest conduit to who we really are. We have the disenchantment of custom. We have the re-enchantment of human desire. And that brings us to the 20th century, where I argue that the aristocratic and the democratic strains, the European and the American strains, one saying there's certain special people who are kind of demigods by virtue of the will, but it's a little bit more innate. The American version, which says anyone can be this if they work hard enough and want it badly enough, kind of gets fused into a Frankenstein of what I call the worst possible, like the worst of both. There's the sense of some people being special and other people are lesser that comes from the more extreme versions of the European model, but also this idea that there's moral failure, that it's your own fault that if you didn't get there, that is associated with the American model. And the place that I see these two models really fusing, as I said, comes in the figure of the contemporary celebrity of old Hollywood. The person, the star, and at this point, usually she, a rare gender change, has what's known as it, for those of you who have heard the phrase it girl. It starts out as it's actually a short story published in 1927 that gets made into a movie with Clara Bow about this mysterious quality, a bit like genius, a bit like any of these other mysterious innate qualities that make some people stars and some people not. And it's not exactly beauty, it's not even exactly sex appeal, it's a kind of personal magnetism that makes you want to be someone. And this is what stars have, so the narrative goes, and ordinary people don't. Except this is also, something else is happening around the time of Old Hollywood, the rise of popular advertising. So this sort of double consciousness starts to appear throughout American culture, that stars are not like us, they're different, they're special, they're innate, they're magical, they're godlike, but they're also shilling products. Clara Bow, Mary Pickford, all of the early silent film stars also have advertising deals with Woodbury soap or face powder, where they basically imply, you can't be like me, but maybe if you bought this cream, you could maybe be like me a little. And this sort of tension, is it innate? Is it learned? Do you work for it? Is it fixed? Is it something you can fake? Really all converge. And at this time, if you thought New Thought was big in the 19th century, like just wait to the early 20s, self-help books about having a good personality, making people do what you want, winning friends and influencing people, suddenly become incredibly popular because everybody wants to have it, personal magnetism, the feeling of being a star. And it's often tied in with New Thought, with these sort of spiritual ideas that actually you're not just doing this in a purely pragmatic way where I'm influencing someone because I'm charismatic. I'm also getting in touch with the pseudo-scientific, pseudo-spiritual energy of the universe, and I'm doing something kind of mystical. And my favorite example of this way of thinking comes in a 1928 advertisement for a correspondence course called Personal Magnetism. So you're reading your magazine, you're looking at your fashion plates, you're looking at Clara Bow, she looks great, I wish I could be like her, and you see this advertisement, and it's great. I don't have them up here. Some of them are like scientific and they show doctors. Some of them show fortune tellers. So you have this sort of blend of the mystical and the scientific. But the tagline is always the same. You have it. Everyone has it. But not one person in 1,000 knows how to use it. And this, I argue, is the core of contemporary notions of artificiality and authenticity. This idea that we all are supposed to have some magical, innate, special, secret thing within ourselves, but the proof that we are the most special, the most chosen, the ones who have it, are that we want it badly enough, that we harness our desire and make that desire real. And that somehow, by doing it, we prove that we're one of the special ones, not one of the boring, normal, unspecial ones. And you can see this dynamic in hustle culture. You can see this on Kim Kardashian's social media, talking about the way that she kind of makes her body in the image of what she wants. That if you want something badly enough, it can and should happen, that you deserve it, that somehow the universe wants you to have it. Now, I'll be honest, in my book, I'm very critical of this cultural shift overall. I worry that the idea that we are so defined by what we want at the expense of other elements of our lives, that this is not a balance or something to be negotiated, but that our desires are central to who we are, is the pendulum perhaps going too far the other way. That it fails to encourage us to think of ourselves as members of community, as people with obligations and responsibilities that we didn't choose. When in many cases, many of the things that are true about us, be they our families, be they circumstances, are things that we did not get to decide for ourselves. Even the fact, spoiler alert, we're all going to die. That none of us chose that, and yet it is part of the reality of human existence. And so I will say a lot of my book is a call to pull back a little on this optimism in the freedom of choice. But that said, I like to end on positive notes. So I do want to say that there are two things that I think in the story of self-making we not only can, but should hold on to. One drawn from the American tradition, one drawn from the European tradition. We'll keep it even. And the first is what I think of the best proponent of self-making, the one who makes me most optimistic about the tradition, I think of the American Frederick Douglass, a black man born into chattel slavery, taught himself to read, which was forbidden at the time, so in secret, escaped slavery, became an abolitionist, an incredible lecturer at one of the most photographed men of the 19th century, who basically advocated for not the abolition of slavery, for temperance, for so much, and really exemplified what I think of as the best of the American dream. And in his lecture, which he gave throughout the 19th century repeatedly on self-made men, he celebrates the possibility, a possibility that is all the more striking when you think that he actually started giving this lecture before the abolition of slavery. That America was a place where whether you were black or white, he says Caucasian or Indian, regardless of how you were born, there is the opportunity to have a better life, to be seen as worthy and dignified in your own self, regardless of how the world saw you or how they saw your fathers. Going back to the idea of the Renaissance, of God's bastards, paternity plays a different role in Douglass. He talks about how, back in old Europe, where where people had inherited wealth and inherited titles, you didn't have to prove yourself in a certain way. But he celebrates the idea that when he says the Lincolns of the sons of the Lincolns in America have to prove themselves Lincolns. That's a kind of adoptive sonship rather than inheritance. There's a vision of real possibility and equality there. So that's what I want us to take from the Americans. But also there's something that I think about a lot that I want us to take from the dandies, and that's this. Many of these figures, Barbie d'Aurevilly and Josephine Péladin or Oscar Wilde in England, are writing against the backdrop of a time not unlike our own. A time of incredible technological change, industrialization, a sense of mass reproduction. Everything is reproducible. Everything is repeatable. We have, all this new technology. We don't know what to do with it. How can I be sure that I'm me, that I am irreducible, that I'm not reproducible, that I'm not a machine, I'm not a robot? There's a bunch of literature at this time about the terror of being a robot, or finding out the woman you're having an affair with is secretly a robot. Like, they're very afraid of robots. And it's precisely because this anxiety about, in an era where everything can be reproduced or imitated, how do I prove that I'm real, that I matter, that my selfhood is original and meaningful to me? And in an era where what passes for contemporary dandyism, I won't say it's dandyism, happens on social media, happens in this digital space and this digital sphere where everything really is just reproducible, where we can, for those of you familiar with a New Yorker article by Gia Tolentino about Instagram face, that Instagram has made it desirable for people to get certain kinds of plastic surgery to have the right kind of face that an influencer has, that it's becoming much more common for young people to modify themselves, not just on a screen, but indeed surgically. All of this sounds nightmarish to me. So if we can take anything from the 19th century dandies, I think it is the importance of holding on to the idea that even though I'm suspicious that authenticity, being purely equated with desire, is a good thing, to be truly ourselves means embracing that we are not machines, and we are not repeatable. And we are, whether some combination of what we choose and what we don't choose, authentically us. Thank you all so much for listening. I believe we have time for questions. I don't quite know how it works, but thank you so much.
So much for the thrilling lecture. I now feel strongly motivated to make something out of myself. I need to figure out what that should be, perhaps. But we now would love to take questions from the audience. Is there anyone who wants to speak first? Somebody has tried to become an influencer and it didn't actually work out.
I can ask a question.
Okay, lovely. Go ahead.
Okay. My question is, was there any reasonable statistical analysis of the people who really believe in this secret or something like that are actually more successful than the people who don't believe in it, but the analysis that really takes into account that people who are just by chance more successful are less likely to abandon this kind of doctrine, right?
So to my knowledge, there's not any kind of full study about the success or failure of a lot of these kind of mindsets. I think it's probably fair to say, though, I think what we do know is that up to a point, body and mind work together. We do know that someone who projects confidence in a room is more likely to be received well. There's often a lot of studies about, for example, gender and the way that men and women present themselves differently in business settings and ways that they are responded to differently. So I think being generous to the proponents of manifesting, there is probably something to be said for the fact that how people perceive us makes a huge impact on our success. You go into a business meeting asking for someone to invest $1 million in your startup. Doesn't matter if the startup is terrible if you're able to kind of convince someone. I've met a lot of people in tech who I cannot say really fill me with confidence in their ideas, but when they walk in, all certain of themselves, it appears to work for them. And I think that there's a kind of other element too, which is that particularly now, and I wish I'd had more time to get into this in my talk, in the age of the internet, the idea that perception can shape reality actually does kind of become true. Between disinformation, stories that become viral, conspiracy theories, memes, anyone who is able to control the kind of public perception, whether or not is true, has much more power now to shape, for example, political elections than they might have before the internet existed. And so I think internet culture has almost made something true that wasn't true before.
Okay, thanks. That's another question.
Thank you. My question is quite simple. What do you think authenticity is?
Sure. So I'm very suspicious of authenticity as a concept, but my understanding of it comes from the philosopher Charles Taylor, which is the model I'm working with. And it's basically something along the lines of, as is popularly used, that my internal sense of myself and my relationship to my desires is in harmony with my external life and how I'm living. So you can say I feel like there's an alignment there. And the reason that I'm suspicious, I think that this is very useful to describe a very particular phenomenon, which I've just described. But often I think it's used culturally in a more general way to say truthful or real or my most authentic self. And I think that the mistake being made by conflating in accordance with my inner sense and desires, and this is true, is that, and I think literature has great examples of this, we're wrong about ourselves a lot of the time. We don't know ourselves very well. I mean, maybe some of you do. Maybe some of you are much wiser, better people than I am. I know I don't know myself. And I think that the idea that we are so in touch with our desires, our thoughts, our feelings, that we can meaningfully say, I know what is true for me. I know what I want. I know what I value and how to get it, is something that I want to resist. And I worry that focusing on authenticity at the expense of, I don't know, some kind of more highfalutin idea like truth means that we lose an important piece of wisdom, which is just how hard it is to really understand our own selves.
Well, I wonder, beautiful talk, great.
Thank you so much.
Enjoyed it a lot. I wonder how much of it is connected to belief or Christianity, because what your talk really resembled me early 90s, where the first evangelists or full gospel people came to Prague and tried to influence us. And I'm Catholic myself, but for the first time in my life, I saw people who really believe that they can heal someone else. It never occurred to us, that you can just believe that you can be better and you will. That was very clearly, deeply believed by those people, never worked. But is it a Christianity and the televangelism, which is another very American thing that doesn't occur in Europe at all? Is it a consequence, a cause of the thing? What is?
I would say it's a consequence. It's downstream for me of the Protestant Reformation. I mean, I think it's impossible to talk about contemporary self-making without thinking about the Protestant Reformation in particular ways that, to speak a little bit generic, to be a bit reductionist, Protestant traditions that do focus on inwardness or personal relationships with God, particularly when you get to the United States and to American Protestantism and American evangelicalism, which tends to be very, very focused on personal relationship with Jesus, my feelings. So I think that this idea of the emotions being deeply, deeply linked to spiritual reality is some part of the puzzle, is the Protestant turn. But of course, it's also possible to say, you know, this Protestant turn happened against the backdrop of things like the printing press and the ability to sit alone in your room reading a book rather than needing a priest to read to you. So it all fits together in that case. I will say that in contemporary America, outside of, let's say, the sort of spiritual but not religious wellness culture of manifesting, the biggest example of faith healing is in fact in evangelical churches, particularly what's known as the prosperity gospel. Yeah. The idea that God wants you to be rich, that if you tithe and pray hard enough, you will get success in this life. Now, as a theologian, I will say this is not really an orthodox traditional part of the Christian tradition. Wanting to be really, really rich and thinking a lot of good things will happen to you before you die, not so orthodox, but about 60% of Protestant churches subscribe to the prosperity gospel, or about 60% of evangelical Protestants, not Protestants altogether. So it's still very much a part of evangelical life, and it's probably more localized. You know, as indeed evangelical Christianity in America tends to be quite localized in that way. But it's something that, again, whether you're at an evangelical church, at a mega church in Texas, or whether you're at a spa in California doing yoga, the ideas are the same, the language is the same, the language that if you just want something badly enough, something kind of magical will happen. It's just a different set of vocabulary around it.
Zuzana wanted to ask a question.
I'll abuse my privilege now. But obviously, I wanted to ask your opinion about this. The opportunity to think, to ponder the question whether I am unique, whether I am normal, whether I'm entitled to success is obviously reserved to a certain part of the planet and certain societies. And at the same time, I've noticed in the literature from the 1990s, from popular psychology, that there were inspections of the term unique and lonely. Like, it was Seligman who said that if you tell your child enough that he or she is unique, he is quite likely to end up depressed, alone, and, you know, out of touch with his peers. So what do you think about that?
I think that's absolutely right. And I think, again, as you know, the caveat is we are talking about a particular subset of the population here, although I think that some of this ideology of self-making, especially in the United States, is really used to kind of justify certain kinds of wealth inequality. You know, today, just as in the Gilded Age, people would use the language of New Thought to say, well, we shouldn't provide social services to the poor because that's going to make them not try so hard, same as today. That being said, the caveat aside, I think you're absolutely right that one of the biggest drawbacks of this way of thinking is you start to see your community as exclusively a burden upon you. That people who maybe exert influence on you in ways that you don't like, they're getting in touch with your authentic, your true self. They're your enemy. And that there are times where that, you know, might be true in certain cases, in certain societies, for certain populations, for example. You can't say that nobody is oppressive or repressive. But I think that the default assumption that if other people are just there to kind of hold you back from your self-fulfillment, that doesn't seem a healthy way of dealing with human relationships. And I think if we're seeing anything, particularly since the pandemic, it's how much communal relationships are important for our mental health. You know, we can't just create ourselves online and live these untethered lives and still feel like we're whole and meaningful human beings.
So I think, if I'm not mistaken, in the beginning of the lecture, you discussed about Renaissance and this idea of man, like, kind of started to realize that the rules of this society are artificial
Yes.
and man-made, and we would put ourselves forward and basically be limitless in some sense. So what I wanted to ask was, in this philosophy or in the idea of like, are we born with it or are we working hard for something? So where does it stand with the regards to morality or ethics? And in some sense, like if we were to think of in like modern sciences, so like cloning is something which could have not been comprehended a long time ago. And it is something which is dividing the society to some extent about morality and ethics in some sense, or other branches of science. So yeah, how does the philosophy go?
That's a great question. And the answer is, it's a tension that exists in every era. How do we figure out what our moral life is like when everything else seems arbitrary? And you could kind of take the most extreme Nietzschean view and say we need a transvaluation of values, and all of these moral ideas about humility and kindness are just outdated, designed to make the strong weak. Or you have to kind of build up some way or other another source for understanding morality. And it does happen in different ways in different eras. For example, in the Enlightenment, particularly in Scotland, was the sort of Scottish Enlightenment, a lot of philosophers were trying to say, like, how can we find the innate moral sense, the innate thing that makes people people? And they talked about love and the love of fellow man and empathy as being a kind of reliable source of something real. But I think it's fair to say that, meanwhile, I'll say in the contemporary discourse, something that always interests me is sort of pop science books that try and find like the selfish gene or the morality gene, or try to use scientific language or biological language to say this is somewhere where we can find human morality. But I think it is a tension, and it is a tricky tension. Where do you think about, or how do you reintroduce morality if you assume that there are no transcendent ideals? And that's not to say it's not doable or it can't happen, but just that I think we haven't necessarily found a shared, cohesive cultural agreement on what that might look like or where that might come from. And so it's a very interesting to me to see different people and different arguments try and deal with that very complicated question. Oh, hello.
Yeah, great talk. I wanted to ask you, we were talking about the distinction between someone being like self-made and half-god, a demigod, actually being kind of a medium of maybe like the creator or the universal consciousness, or I don't know, the god. And then there's people that are kind of like trying to fake this. And I see this as the distinction between like someone doing some shape or wants to shape the reality of their own selfish needs, as opposed to someone who is kind of trying to make it work for the benefit of everyone. And do you have like, have you looked like historically at like how to distinguish between these like people that maybe actually have been connected to this like universal like well-being plan and someone's that are just doing it for their own good?
That's a fantastic question. I think it's hard to tell from the outside. I mean, we can say Albert Dürer and Da Vinci can paint, and Kim Kardashian can't. And we can start talking about the actual things that people produce or don't produce. But in many cases, it is the sort of literature of self-making keeps coming up again and again against this problem of we can't really tell from the outside who's faking it and who isn't. Particularly from the 19th century onwards, and especially in the United States, you have these figures like P.T. Barnum, founder of the Barnum and Bailey Circus, also a known hoaxer, who coined this word humbug to describe a pleasant, like a little bit of a strategic lie. But the idea was like, you tell a little lie and then people buy your product, and then once people are buying your product, then the lie becomes true because your product really does become the most popular or the best or what have you. And so I think that the thing that is the common thread in a lot of these different movements, once we're moving away from artistic production or actually making something, is can you get people to believe in what you're saying and make them do what you want? And that is the power of the politician, is certainly the power of the celebrity, to have that, like that 1928 advertisement, personal magnetism. And so I think that there are almost certainly are people who both have personal magnetism and are using it for good ends, for the good of the world. But I don't think personal magnetism, used in this very specific 1928 sense, is automatically good or bad. It just allows you to have certain kinds of power. And insofar as it's predicated on the idea that that power is the power to change reality, not just the power to lie, is when things start to get dangerous and dicey.
Any other questions? Wave your hand. There's a lot of people. Okay, there's a question.
Thank you very nice talk. I recall one idea of C.S. Lewis, written in one of his essays. It is not about, he talks about originality in terms of the scholarship, scientific work. And he says that nobody who adores originality, speaks about originality, wants to be original, and does everything what he wants to become original, would ever be original. And he says, well, do your work. Doesn't matter if it is a small piece or the large piece, as good as you can for the work itself. And the originality will come to you without even noticing. So what do you think, how it is related to that?
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with that. I'm a C.S. Lewis fan. I think that the pursuit of originality is, as you point out, it's very likely to just not work. Everyone trying to be original is not going to make anybody original. But also I think that separately from the question of does it work, is it desirable? And I don't think pursuing originality is desirable. I think we can pursue goodness, we can pursue truth, we can pursue beauty. There are many things that are worth pursuing that don't demand, that are not predicated on the idea that originality is something that we have to pursue. I think a healthier perspective is to say, we're all different human beings. We're different centers of consciousness. Each one of us has, you know, the wonderful line from Hamlet about being bounded in a nutshell and king of infinite space. And I think when you don't think of originality as something you have to prove, that you just take it as a given, that it is something that each of us has. It takes a lot of load off you, first of all, mentally, but it also frees us up to chase things that are perhaps worthier goals, perhaps better goals for the world, and also kind of help us think, you know, is it so wrong to want to be like the people we admire? I think, of course, you know, traditionally in religious practice, the idea of, you know, the imitation of Christ or the imitation of saints, you were supposed to want to imitate exemplars of the thing that you were pursuing. And so I think to say we have originality, we don't have to worry about it, we don't have to pursue, we don't have to seek it. Let's spend our time seeking something better.
Yeah. Hello. Thank you for the talk. I just wanted to ask something that is quite actual in the recent times. I think you said that there was a lot of cycle, like different phases of what human thought has been going through and what people were thinking at some point during civilization. And I'm wondering now that there are so many tools online. For example, artificial intelligence, how it's using all the input to recreate what humans are thinking. Do you think that we can, as humans, resist this or adapt or somehow manage this new technology that can kind of change what we think and how we think?
Yes. Do I think we should resist it? Yes. Do I think we can resist it? I hope so. I think I'm very wary of AI. I'm wary of the sort of scale of technological reproduction and our faith in it. I logically know that, machine learning means being trained on what's already there. There's not, secret demons out there on the internet, and I know that logically. At the same time, I think my response is one, almost a superstitious response of caution, precisely because I think a lot of the ideal, it depends on what this technology is for and what these tools are for. And I think that's a question we always have to ask ourselves, what is the purpose of this tool? And if it is something that, can cure the sick, if it's something that can help us keep in touch with our families when we can't be close to them, there are good human ends to all forms of technology. But there's also bad ends, there's bad purposes. And I think the idea of simply wanting to amass certain kinds of money, to amass certain kinds of power, to think of ourselves as being freer and more untethered to the physical world that we are, that's going to hurt the things that make us human. It's going to hurt the kind of connections we have. So I'm not a Luddite, but I do think we should be much more cautious and careful than we are about embracing technological development, and always think and encourage the people in charge of making these things to think what the ultimate purpose is beyond making a bunch of money.
Yeah. Thank you for a great talk. I have a question. So you showed how the people acquire the goal, so how to influence the society and how to show their importance, so the celebrities and so on. The question would be why they do it. So why they need this enormous feedback from the society that they are worthy, and on the opposite you say go for the truth, for the beauty. How to find the motivation to somehow ignore the society, but to be part of it?
I mean, I think that's if anything, it's precisely our need to be reflected in the eyes of others that I think can tell us something really important about ourselves. We are social beings. We do need each other. Each of these stories of personal branding or these of self-creation take place in a society where there is an implied audience. And I think one way is to say, okay, some people are selfish or narcissistic or attention-seeking, and another way, maybe a better way, is to say, this is proof of how much we need each other. This is proof of how much we need relations. Somebody asked me at a talk last year, what is the best antidote to this kind of self-making that I was criticizing? And my answer was and remains friendship. Real friendship. When you know somebody that's seen you before you got successful, or before you got married, or before you had some changes, and remembers you and celebrates that you're changing, but also if you get too far off, the person they know is willing to tell you, hey, you're being a bit of a jerk, or success has gone to your head. These kinds of relationships that are back and forth are much more likely to help us reflect ourselves and figure out who we really are than somebody we've never met clicking like because they think we look hot in a photo.
So as it happens, this was the last question of tonight, at least from the official part of the evening. Tara, thank you so much again for the lovely evening. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you have a little bit more time on your hands, you're cordially invited to the back door, the backstairs, downstairs, down there, to continue our informal talks. So if you're free, please come and join us. If you have to go, it was absolutely lovely to spend the evening with you. Goodbye.